For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. This is Cybertide, a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. Today I'm talking with Mark Sangster. Mark is the Vice President and Chief of Strategy at Adlumin. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Heather.
So we're talking about a rise in ransomware attacks against the automotive industry. Specifically today, I'd like to ask you about the attack against CDK Global. CDK is a software firm for our listeners that might not be familiar. Car dealerships use CDK to manage everything from scheduling to sales and orders. And although CDK did not confirm this, industry experts speculate that a $25 million ransom was paid as a result of recent attacks. So can you take us through this story and talk a little bit about the impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the kind of thing that I've been talking about for years now, right? Now, wasn't in the auto industry that I would discuss this, but I would talk about it in similar industries that we're all kind of dependent upon some sort of core intrinsic type of system, right? So, when we see generic attacks, it's against Microsoft, like against operating systems or against specific perimeter defenses and things like that, which tend to be very horizontal, right? They kind of cross all sorts of different industries and it doesn't really matter, whether you're in government or whatever, we're all using kind of basically the same tools. But when it comes to this one, CDK Global is a software firm that serves car dealerships. So they have a very specific type of technology for a singular kind of audience that's a homogeneous audience that has the same kind of things they need to do, right? Like to go through the financing for a new car and inventory the vehicles on their lot and deal with maintenance and figure out how to upsell and market to their customers and all that kind of stuff. And so it's like a single point of failure. And the problem with these types of organizations in general is that they have sort of, a monopoly across the industry, but they don't tend to be the same sort of global size company that would have a monopoly if we went up one level to generic, IT infrastructure, right? So they don't have the same kind of resources. And in this case, when you hit one, you're taking down the entire industry. I used to talk about this in manufacturing, in legal services and healthcare, saying what happens when they go after one of the top patient record systems and they figure out how to infiltrate it at source. And now if they've done that, they go off and they deploy ransomware and they take out thousands of hospitals, not one hospital. And it's the same concept is exactly what happened here, which is no surprise. Again, allegedly, they paid out 387 Bitcoin, which is somewhere around 25 million US dollars. And it wouldn't surprise me because they shut down that organization and you have something like 15,000 car dealerships screaming, right? None of them can sell cars. They're all going back to manual paperwork. You can imagine the delays. And I can imagine in the auto industry, particularly now where it's kind of just bouncing back, the last thing you need is any kind of delay or tides that are pushing you back that are hindering those kind of sales. So this sort of thing I think I hate to say this, has been coming for a long time. And, part of this too is one, even though we're going to talk about this, even though some government regulators have said, hey, auto industry, you need to pay attention to cybersecurity and the threats, a lot of the vendors just don't, right? I still see, and I'm not trying to say that's CDK, but within these industries, these sub-segmented types of businesses where they have a very specific type of tool and service, they don't, right? They think, well, we're not a target. Right? Who's going to know we even exist? They're going to go after the Microsofts and the Ciscos and the Apples of the world. They're not coming after us. And that's not true, right? These guys have gotten really good at what I call sort of second generation social engineering, which is knowing how to target an industry. Like, hey, you're a lawyer or you're an auto industry, you're in a car dealership. Here's the specific tools that you use. Here's the type of language, the things that matter to you, the drivers in the industry, regulators, all that kind of stuff. So I know what, your heart rate, right? I know what matters to you. And once they have that, they look like an insider. It becomes extremely easy to socially engineer and into, a company get in at source as they did.
I like that you brought up that, one of the things that we would think about CDK is, well, hey, nobody knows who they are, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we said with Change Healthcare. So I see a lot of parallels between this attack and the Change Healthcare breach. And you mentioned that this is something that's a problem in healthcare as well. When I work with my clients on managing risk, many of them are now saying that these are the types of business outages that they would not have predicted. And those of us in cybersecurity have sort of been low-key really worried about this for a long time. What are some of the steps that companies can take to start accounting for this level of disruption? Because it's not necessarily a cyber attack on them that they can do anything with an incident response plan. It's really more business continuity planning and disaster recovery, I would think.
Yeah, 100%, right? And I think here, this is, the old lesson of, third-party risk, that if you've got a massive single point of failure like this kind of issue or this sort of software, then you really have to focus on that. And I think the problem, again, with the customers of this type of software is that they themselves don't see them as a target. They really don't think that there's a major issue. There's nothing we're stealing. It's all the misconceptions that you and I sort of sit there and we kind of have to like bite our tongue and try to keep our poker face on because otherwise you'll be eye rolling and falling over and getting up and probably using all sorts of unflattering language. That's the problem, right? Is I don't think they understand this, and their disaster recovery business continuity planning's got to be in place. They are financial institutions, right? They're lending, there's leasing, there's buying, there's a lot of transactions. PII in a dealership is going back and forth. And man, you think about like how much information do they collect that probably sits there, right? That wasn't being managed in a sense of like once data is stale, how is it destroyed? How do we make sure that it doesn't get in the wrong hands? And they're not thinking like that, right? They're thinking like brick and mortar mom and pop type operations. Because the reality is that's when you get down to the dealership level, that's what it is, right? It's private ownership or group ownership. So there's a change, right? They have to start thinking like a utility, like a hospital, and recognize they are a target. But then I think a lot of that is working with these vendors and understanding, what's the risk posed to their business and what are they doing about it? So how do they understand, well, okay, here's the one system we use. If this thing goes down, what would we do? Do we have paper backups? How would we recover for a period of time? Are there backup systems? What does that company put in place? How long would it take them to recover? And during that period, what's our fallback? As in, how do we keep the business running, whether it's by candlelight, but it's still business as usual. And I think that's what these organizations have to start thinking about. And the reality is until one of these types of tectonic events occurs, they're not going to, because, we saw the year before, we saw the FTC come out and talk about privacy rules and sort of upping the cyber risk game for auto dealerships. But other than a whole lot of noise in the market and like, oh, we got to go buy some security tool, I don't know that they reduce their risk necessarily or truly understand what they were facing.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Adlumin Inc. provides enterprise-grade security to mid-market organizations. Its security operations platform and managed detection and response services combines all your data into one view to illuminate security risks and accelerate security workflows. Security teams are often stretched thin and are faced with increasing threats to respond to like ransomware and data theft. Adlumin's patented technology simplifies these challenges by providing organizations with machine learning detection and automated response capabilities to halt threats quickly. The platform also includes threat hunting, automated incident response, vulnerability management, honeypots, darknet exposure monitoring, compliance reporting and monitoring, and more. Join the conversation and see how Adlumin can enhance your security program without increasing your workload. Visit adlumin.com.
And now, back to the podcast.
What I hear a lot too is that some of these smaller organizations that use a software that's well known in their industry, they assume that that company that provides the software really has their act together and that they're really doing everything that they can from a security and privacy and disaster recovery perspective. And that's very often not the case.
Oh, totally, right? I mean, we saw that with things like Zoom, for example, during the beginning of the pandemic and, publishing white papers and, statements from the CEO about how your security is our primary concern. Generally, when you're using that statement, that's probably not true, right? It's probably the opposite.
Right.
Somebody in marketing went and cut and pasted that from somewhere, and that just makes it worse. And I agree, right? They're not thinking of that. And there is a blind assumption that these companies know what they're doing. And it's kind of that assumption, well, like you're a doctor or an engineer or a scientist or whatever it is, you're smarter than I am. My job's selling cars and you guys are way smarter than me. So I'm sure you've solved the problem. And I think this is it. You can't just make the assumptions. You need to ask and you need to understand. And, that's where I would say things like, is an individual auto dealership going to be able to deal with that? No. But I think the associations and the affiliations with the industry, that's where they've got to step in and start to go, okay, guys, how do we as a collective talk to these core vendors, on which we're reliant and determine whether or not they have the right security in place. And if they don't, how am I mitigating that, right? Do I start looking at other alternatives? Like I said, do I pay for backups? Do I need more insurance? What is it that I need to do to try and offset that risk? And I don't think they are, right? This is typical of what we see in other industries that as cyber attacks spread, it started in finance primarily. Financial services, banking, insurance, et cetera, they started to respond with regulations. And then healthcare kind of got hit next and they started to respond. And even for those two, it was more about privacy than it was about security. Now, I think the big one for auto industry is to kind of just go back to the roots and think about cybersecurity as the CIA, like confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and which one matters to you most. And I'd argue when this was down, it was availability,
Yeah.
right? Then confidentiality, because that's when the government shows up and goes, well, hang on, what got leaked, and are you in trouble? And we're going to figure that out. There's a huge risk. We've seen this one play out. You affect 15,000 customers and you're paying out 25 million, or allegedly paying out a $25 million ransomware payment when what was the average that year was something like 500 or 600,000.
Yeah.
Tells you how painful
Yeah.
this was.
It's interesting that you drew the parallel between confidentiality, availability, and, we talk about data integrity too, because I was thinking, this is really talking about the availability of data. Somewhat related to that, the confidentiality of data. The FTC amended a rule in 2021 that now includes auto dealers as financial institutions, and they're subject to privacy rules if that dealer extends credit or financing. What's your take on this?
I think it's good that they do this, right? And they're not asking for a lot when you think about it, right? So when the FTC did come out with the ruling, what's the ruling here? I just make sure I got it right. It's Regulation 16 CFR 314.2H, right? It's the Code of Federal Regulations. It makes it super cool when you do that. And, I think they're right, because up till now, I think the problem is that the focus was always on what I would consider to be traditional lenders, the companies that typically have PII, right? Financial information on hand. So banks, credit unions, insurers, all that kind of stuff. And they've got more regulations around them. And then you've got all these sort of peripheral things like real estate and auto dealerships that have the similar kind of information. You're putting in a credit check to get your loan or whatever to buy your car. Same stuff as if you walked into a bank to get a mortgage, and yet they were going scot-free. And so I think the FTC was right to expand this one, and they kind of did it proactively to some degree. And when you look at what they're talking about, it's not major stuff, right? Like having a dedicated individual to make sure that you got the right program in place, and you can outsource that. Conducting periodic risk assessments, implementing, putting the right controls in to protect your organization, training your employees with, proactive awareness programs, maintaining oversight of third-party service providers. Ouch. And doing, the kind of the basic stuff. Like this is brushing and flossing of cybersecurity, right? No one's asking for too much here. But what I can see from an automotive or an auto dealership's perspective is they weren't paying for this, right? They're probably paying an MSP that comes in and sets up their IT for them and their telephony and does all that kind of stuff. And suddenly now they're having to put out X dollars, probably anywhere from $5 up to like $50 an endpoint or a user to suddenly protect this stuff. And I think that's the big question, because it isn't just the vendor, right? Yes, the vendor has a good chunk of the responsibility here, like a CDK when you are core to an industry. But at the same time, we still see, right, the majority of these, major cyber incidents occur because someone's credentials were compromised. So how many people at the dealership, the receptionist, the salesperson, when there's nobody in the dealership and they've done their paperwork, is probably, on Facebook or doing whatever, and don't understand they're doing that on a corporate device, and they're exposing it to bad guys because it's an easy play for them. And once, as I've seen this, like with this industry, this probably started as limited attacks against auto dealers. And then they figured out, hang on, they're all using this one piece of software. And frankly, this is where your marketing always is going to hurt. It's like painting a bullseye on you, right? When you go out there and you go, we're the number one software supplier to auto dealerships, or we're the number one patient record, we've got bazillions of healthcare records flowing through our system every day. That's really good from a sales perspective. And I know that's going to help. But then bad guys read it and go, okay, so you're the big gorilla in the market.
Yeah.
Okay, we're
You're the one we
one
want to target.
100%.
Yeah, I think this adds an interesting layer too for the dealerships, right? Because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. So that person who's there, who's selling cars, they don't recognize, right, that now they're subject to these rules that in many cases, it's much bigger companies with a whole compliance department or a whole legal department.
Yeah.
And so even just getting them to understand what the requirements are and communicating that down to their employees, this is what you and I talk about all the time, is employee training is key for these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's it, right? Again, when you labor on these misconceptions like, we have nothing worth stealing, I'm just the receptionist, or, I'm a person who works in the service department and, I check people in when they drop off the car for an oil change. What can I do? And it's like, well, you do everything, man. You've got an account access into that central software platform. And from there, I can move around, right? Yeah, maybe you don't have access to the financial pieces, but it's not that hard for criminals to jump that far. So I do think there needs to be kind of 3 levels, I would say, of awareness training, right? The first is up at the board or the group level that says, here's the risks posed, here's the implications, here's your obligations, and so on. Then you're going to have sort of the franchisers, the people down below who, they own the whatever car brand dealership, and they don't understand it because their bread and butter, their entire life has been selling cars and it's a family business. So they need to understand it. And then you've got to have the employees. And I think when you do awareness training or you do testing, this is where you got to make it realistic and representative of a dealership. So have that person try to go after the service check-in person, have somebody sitting on the Wi-Fi, and they've got their car in for an oil change, and see if they can get into the main network and, do those kind of things, because that's what bad guys are doing, right? Like that's exactly what they're doing, or they're paying somebody to sit in that dealership and do it. So it's pretty straightforward. So you've got to understand, what's it look like when it shows up in your inbox or in your front door or your waiting room, and be able to start to recognize it. And then, probably some of this is also clamping down on, what you can do on personal and corporate systems. Cause, I know, like, we all own cars, right? When I have the guy that I call and I'm like, hey man, I'm looking for a car, and it's going back and forth on text, and I know he's doing this at 10 o'clock at night. I guarantee it's not on a corporate device, or it's on a private or a personal device that has access to those corporate systems. He's got to look me up and figure out, what am I driving today, and how old is it, and how many miles are on it, and can he flip it, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, this is a topic that I think is really timely. As we said, we're seeing this more and more. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think this is a good proof of the theory here, right? That when you can go after a core element of any industry, patient healthcare record, an auto dealership management system, document management system in a law firm, whatever it might be, the risk here is exponential. And so these organizations that don't think they're targets need to figure this out. It's not big companies. It's not just big organizations, right? It's not just mega healthcare, university healthcare centers. It's small dental practices with 3 dentists. They are as equally targeted. And frankly, to them, while it doesn't make the same kind of headlines, I think it's a lot more damaging, right? And same thing to a dealership. I'm sure the margins are pretty tight, and you're trying to make a lot of this on service and parts and all that kind of stuff. This is the last thing you need, right? This is the thing, sending that out to all your customers going, oh, by the way, this happened, and they got your financial information, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. That is the kind of brand reputation damage. And frankly, I think in this kind of industry, as we've all probably personally experienced, it's down to trust, right? It's you build a reputation and a relationship with your customer or your dealer, and you trust them to fix your car and to give you a fair deal on a new one and all that kind of stuff. So it's time to think of cyber risk as any other risk that dealership would face, like economic headwinds, supplier delays. And when I mean that, I don't mean software. I mean like availability of cars and parts and stuff like that from the manufacturers. It's the same thing. They just now need to recognize it as such.
Yeah. What it comes down to, right, is it's down to that trust. And in this situation, it's very easy, if your trust is broken, to switch to another vendor.
Agreed. And that's it, right? So yes, particularly in this, cars aren't sticky. They're not like other things you buy and you're tied in for a long time. Yeah, I know we have loans and we have all that stuff, but it's a lot easier to say, the heck with it. I've had my car for 2 or 3 years. I'm going to walk into a competitor's dealership and buy a different brand and flip it. It's not the sale they made today. It's knowing that when that car comes up for renewal, like you've paid it off or the lease is up or whatever, they want to ensure you don't walk in and go have your car back and they sort of storm out and they go across the street to your competitor. It's a pretty cutthroat market. This feels like a place that you can do a good job at a reasonable investment to protect your organization, right? And make sure that you can keep those relationships with your customers.
Mark, thanks for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Always a pleasure, Heather.
For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. Cybertide is a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com.